Hi everybody, it's Linda with Overbrook Quilt Connection, and today we are doing block 12 of Moda's Stitch Pink. This is called a House on the Hill block. So we're making a house. So let me show you what we're working on. The first thing that you'll do is take a 3.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle, which is going to be the roof of your house. And you've got two 3.5 inch background squares. You'll draw a diagonal line on the back of them and you'll stitch on the diagonal line. You'll line it up with the corner of your rectangle, stitch on it on the line, fold it back, press it back to make sure it matches the outline of the original rectangle, and then you will cut it off 1/4 of an inch away from your stitching. Make sure when you do that that you have them facing the opposite direction, so you have a roof instead of a parallelogram or something like that. But anyhow, I chose to use a kind of a fussy cut piece to make sure that the rows, the design was even on the roof. So anyhow, you can use whatever you want, of course. Then you'll make your house, and there's two different kinds of strips that we will sew together. You've got a 2.5 by 1.5 inch pieces. Yes, 2.5 by 1.5 inch rectangles, and you'll attach 2.5 inch squares to them, another rectangle, and then the bottom are 2.5 by 3.5 inch rectangles. And you'll make two strips of these. Now the light colors become your windows. So, just keep that in mind as you're picking the fabrics that you're using. Now between those two rows, then you have another row that actually this becomes the door of the house. So you start with the 1.5 by 2.5 inch rectangle, then another 2.5 inch square, then a 2.5 inch square of whatever you're making your house out of, your darker fabric. And then the bottom one is a 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangle, and that'll become the door of your house. Okay, now these two rows here are shorter than this center one. You've got two strips that you will sew, one to either side of the center strip, and those go down the entire length of that strip. Those are 9.5 inches by 1.5 inches. So you'll have two of those, and you'll sew one to either side. Then next, we've got some strips that we'll sew on the outer edges of these shorter ones, and then a piece that goes across the entire bottom of that section. So let me do some more stitching. I'll come back and show you the next step. All right, I've sewn a few more pieces together. I sewed the long strips, the 9.5 inch strips, to either side of my center. And then I also sewed the shorter strip that is 7.5 inches long. I sewed to the outside of each of those. So when you're doing that, just remember you need the 2.5 inch light squares towards the top, and you need to sew one of those to the right and one of those to the left, so because they need to be opposites of each other. And then and also remember that the smaller rectangle is to the top and the larger rectangle is to the bottom. So I actually skipped a step. Once I sewed this to this, once I sewed the strip to the outside edge of this unit that we made in the first segment, then we sew a rectangle to the bottom, which is 3.5 by 2.5. So one thing to keep in mind, if you're using a directional fabric, if you decide you want to use a stripe or something, just remember that you're going to have to pay attention to that as you cut your pieces. I'm lucky enough here that I don't have a directional fabric other than in my roof. But if you would decide to do that, you need to make sure that everything's going to be cut the same direction, or you're going to have some things going crosswise and up and down. It might look kind of weird. So what is left to do here is to sew these 3 sections together, which will complete then the bottom of our house, and then also the roof to it. So I will be back and I will show you the completed block. All right, this block is finished. Boy, I'm having to get back a long ways so you can see the whole thing. But here is your completed block. Now I can see some of you really playing around with this. I can see you changing the size of the windows or flipping things around and having the bigger rectangles at the top on the outsides and the smaller in the middle. I can see people putting designs on their roofs or designs on their above their door and things like that. So I encourage you to play around with this and make this your own house, your own design. One thing about when I put it together, I did press everything towards the dark, all the seams. I pressed away from the windows, away from the doors. I pressed away from the sash, towards the dark sashing strips everywhere. And then I pressed it towards the roof. Be careful as you get to these outside edges, because that is a bias edge coming down into that right here. From this seam here, that is a bias edge. So just make sure that you're careful as you go across that seam, because it kind of wants to stretch a little bit right there. So anyhow, this is block 12, and we'll be back tomorrow with block 13. Thanks, everybody.